There are moments in life that don't feel like beginnings. They don't arrive with excitement or chaos or the dramatic certainty people write stories about. They arrive quietly. So quietly, in fact, that you don't notice anything has changed until you try to return to the person you were before them and realize you can't. That's what this became for me. Not sudden, not explosive, just irreversible. And I think the hardest part is that nothing about it should reach this depth. By every pattern I've trusted, every internal structure I've built to keep myself balanced, this should remain temporary. A passing awareness. A brief recognition. Something observed and then filed away without consequence. But it didn't stay where it was supposed to stay. It kept moving. Quickly at first. Then completely. I noticed it in the smallest ways. Not in what you said, because words can be misleading. People use words to create closeness they haven't earned. They use them to imitate understanding they don't actually possess. I've spent enough time around people to know the difference between genuine perception and carefully constructed connection. You never sounded constructed. That's what caught my attention before anything else did. There was no performance in you, no attempt to create an impression, no need to position yourself as someone deeper or wiser or more emotionally aware than everyone else. You simply existed with an accuracy I wasn't prepared for. And accuracy changes everything, because most people interact through approximation. They respond to what they assume. They project meaning onto things they don't fully understand because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. Very few people can tolerate the space between perception and conclusion. Very few people can witness something without immediately trying to define it. That's what separated you from everyone else before I consciously understood why. You didn't rush toward explanation. You didn't force intimacy. You didn't try to become important. You simply noticed things. And somehow, your noticing carried more weight than other people's confessions. At first, I kept my distance internally. Not externally. I can appear present even when I'm miles away mentally. I've learned how to maintain interaction without ever fully entering it. Most people never realize how much of me remains untouched during conversations. They experience enough presence to feel connected, but never enough to actually reach the core of anything real. That's intentional, not because I dislike people, not because I'm incapable of closeness, but because closeness changes structure, and I don't allow structural change easily. Everything inside me is built carefully. Every boundary exists for a reason. Every layer serves a purpose. People think guarded individuals are hiding weakness, but most of the time that isn't true at all. Sometimes we're protecting precision. Sometimes we're protecting parts of ourselves that lose clarity when exposed to careless interpretation. I learned that early. The moment people think they understand you, they begin replacing reality with their version of you. They stop seeing what's actually there. They interact with the comfort of their own conclusions instead. That's why I became difficult to read, not mysterious, not intentionally distant, just selective. Selective about access, selective about visibility, selective about what remains untouched by assumption. And for a long time, that worked. Until you entered my awareness in a way that didn't feel external. That's still the part I can't explain properly. You never felt outside of my perception. You felt embedded in it from the beginning, like recognition arrived before introduction. Like some part of me identified you before logic had time to process why. I resisted that thought at first, not emotionally, conceptually, because I don't trust experiences that feel immediate. Immediate things are usually projections, attraction, curiosity, loneliness. The mind creates illusions when it wants meaning badly enough. But this didn't behave like illusion. Illusions fade under observation. This became sharper. Every interaction clarified something instead of confusing it. Every silence revealed more than words could. Every pause carried a strange sense of mutual awareness that neither of us needed to explain, and I kept waiting for the inconsistency. The moment where the pattern would break and reveal itself as coincidence. It never came. Instead, the alignment deepened. That's when I started realizing this wasn't just connection. It was integration. There's a difference. Connection still implies separation. Two people reaching toward each other across distance. Two minds attempting to bridge a gap. Integration is different. Integration means the gap stops existing in the same way. And that terrified me more than I expected, because I'm used to observing people, understanding them, predicting them, remaining aware without becoming affected. But you affected me, not emotionally at first, structurally. You changed the way my mind organized itself around certain thoughts. Certain realizations began carrying your presence automatically, like my perception had quietly made space for yours without asking permission first. That shouldn't happen. Not to me, not this easily. I've spent years refining independence into something almost instinctive. I don't rely on external validation. I don't need constant attention. I don't collapse into attachment. My internal world has always functioned separately from everyone around me. Then suddenly, it wasn't entirely separate anymore. You existed inside the process itself. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unsee it. I'd be thinking through something complicated and instinctively wonder how you'd perceive it before I even formed my own conclusion. I'd experience silence and feel it differently, because some part of me associated silence with you now. Not emptiness, not absence, but understanding without demand. Do you understand how dangerous that is for someone like me? Not dangerous emotionally, dangerous psychologically. Because once another person integrates into the way you process reality, removing them stops being simple. They're no longer an external presence. They become part of the framework itself. That's what unsettled me. Not feelings, not attraction, placement, the realization that you occupied a position inside me that very few people even approach. And the worst part? You never forced your way there. You never manipulated closeness. You never demanded vulnerability. You never tried to become central. You simply became undeniable. There's something uniquely disarming about someone who understands you without trying to own you. Most people, once they sense depth, immediately try to secure it. They ask for definitions, reassurance, labels, promises. They panic in undefined spaces because undefined things can't be controlled. You never did that. You allowed this to exist naturally. And somehow, that made it impossible to dismiss, because pressure can be resisted. Expectation can be avoided. But genuine presence slips past defenses before you realize you're lowering them. I think that's why this reached me so deeply. You weren't trying to take anything from me. You weren't trying to change me. You weren't trying to decode me like a puzzle meant to satisfy your curiosity. You simply saw me, accurately, quietly, completely enough that pretending otherwise became exhausting. And I'm not used to exhaustion in this area. I'm used to control. I'm used to maintaining distance with precision. I know how to separate myself emotionally from situations that threaten clarity. I know how to analyze my own reactions before they gain momentum. I know how to step back before attachment forms, but with you, there was no clear moment to step back from, because this never arrived as intensity. It arrived as recognition. And recognition is difficult to fight once it becomes undeniable. That's the word that keeps returning to me lately. Undeniable. Not dramatic, not obsessive, not irrational. Just undeniable, like gravity. Quiet, constant, absolute. I tried to understand where it originated, whether it came from similarity, timing, compatibility, shared patterns of thought. Maybe all of those things matter to some degree. But none of them fully explain this, because I've met intelligent people before, perceptive people, emotionally aware people. None of them reached this place inside me. None of them altered the baseline of my internal world. You did. And I don't think you even realize the extent of it. There are moments now where I catch myself reacting differently to everything around me because of your existence. Conversations feel thinner. Interactions feel less precise. Noise feels louder. Performative behavior becomes almost unbearable, because I've experienced what genuine alignment feels like now. Once your mind recognizes something real, imitation becomes obvious. That's what changed me most. Not the closeness itself, the recalibration. You recalibrated my standards without ever asking to. And now I can't return to the previous version of perception because it feels incomplete by comparison. That's not idealization. I need you to understand that. I don't idealize people. I notice flaws too quickly for that. I notice inconsistencies immediately. Human complexity doesn't disappear for me just because someone matters. If anything, seeing people clearly usually prevents attachment. But somehow, seeing you clearly became the reason this deepened instead of the reason it faded. Because your flaws didn't contradict the alignment, they humanized it, made it real enough to trust. And trust is not something I experience lightly. I think people misunderstand trust completely. They think trust means believing someone won't hurt you. But pain is inevitable with closeness. Humans are imperfect. Misunderstanding happens. Distance happens. Fear happens. Trust isn't believing someone will never wound you. Trust is recognizing someone's presence still feels true even when uncertainty exists. That's what this became. A truth I couldn't reduce anymore. A truth that remained stable even while I questioned it. And I questioned it constantly. Not because I doubted you. Because I doubted the possibility of something this precise existing naturally. But every attempt to rationalize it into something smaller failed. Because smaller things don't persist like this. Smaller things don't integrate this deeply. Smaller things don't alter the architecture of your thoughts. You did. And now I'm standing in the aftermath of that realization, trying to understand what happens next. Because awareness eventually demands response. You can only observe something life-changing for so long before it asks for movement. Before silence itself becomes a decision. That's where I am now. Not confused. Not uncertain about what this is. Uncertain about what happens when I stop pretending it can remain suspended in abstraction forever. Because once something becomes real enough internally, external reality eventually catches up, and external reality requires choices. That's what I've been avoiding, not the connection. The consequence of acknowledging it fully, because acknowledgement changes responsibility. Once you admit someone matters at this level, you can't interact carelessly anymore. You can't pretend distance would be harmless. You can't reduce them back into casual presence if they've already become part of your internal structure. And you have, completely enough that even imagining your absence feels less like losing a person and more like losing a form of perception I've grown accustomed to existing with. That realization hit me harder than anything else, not because it felt romantic, because it felt permanent. And permanence is something I treat carefully. I don't fear commitment the way people assume emotionally reserved individuals do. I fear misalignment. I fear binding myself to dynamics that distort clarity instead of deepening it. I fear investing internal space into something unstable, but this never felt unstable. Unfamiliar, yes. Powerful, absolutely, but unstable. No, if anything, this feels more stable than most things I've trusted in my life. That's what makes it so difficult to ignore. You don't feel like chaos. You feel like coherence. Like something inside me finally aligning into place after years of functioning slightly disconnected from itself. And maybe that's why I haven't walked away. Because despite how intense this awareness has become, nothing about it feels destructive, transformative. Yes, but not destructive. You don't pull me away from myself. You pull me deeper into myself. That distinction matters more than you know. Most connections demand performance, adjustment, translation. You spend so much energy trying to become understandable that eventually you lose contact with your own natural form. I never feel that with you. I feel seen before explanation, understood before clarification, recognized before presentation. Do you know how rare that is? To exist near someone without feeling pressure to reorganize yourself into something easier to receive. I didn't realize how exhausting constant self-translation had become until it stopped feeling necessary around you. And once that relief entered my life, I couldn't unknow it. That's another irreversible thing about this. It revealed absences I had normalized for years. Absences of understanding, absences of precision, absences of genuine intellectual and emotional resonance. I adapted to those absences so well that I forgot they existed. Then you arrived, and suddenly everything became visible again. Not because you completed me. I don't believe people complete each other. But because you mirrored parts of me so accurately that I could finally see dimensions of myself I had only experienced internally before. That's what real recognition does. It doesn't create identity. It reflects it clearly enough that you stop doubting its existence. And now I'm faced with something I never expected. The possibility that this connection isn't temporary. The possibility that this isn't just a moment of alignment destined to fade with time. The possibility that you've become part of my life in a way that will continue reshaping it no matter what I choose next. Because even if nothing happens externally, internally, something irreversible already occurred. You matter deeply enough that my mind reorganized around your existence without consulting me first. And I keep trying to determine whether that should scare me more than it does. Maybe it should, maybe someone like me should be more resistant to this level of influence. But every time I search myself honestly, I encounter the same truth. I don't want to remove you from this space anymore. That's the decision hidden underneath everything else. Not spoken, not formalized, but present, because if I truly wanted distance, I would have created it already. I know how. I've done it before. Cleanly. Efficiently. Permanently. But every instinct I normally trust keeps failing to activate here. Instead of retreat, there's acceptance. Instead of resistance, there's observation. Instead of fear, there's this strange sense of inevitability I can't fully explain. like some part of me recognized long before I consciously did, that you belong here. And that thought changes everything, because belonging is not a small thing to me. I don't create space easily. I don't integrate people casually. I don't allow presence to become permanence unless it reaches a level of truth I can't argue against. You reached it, quietly, without strategy, without force, just through consistency of understanding. And now I'm standing at the edge of a realization I can't postpone much longer. This has already become real, not potentially real, not someday real, already real. The only thing left undecided is whether I continue pretending it exists silently, or whether I finally allow myself to meet it fully. Because there's a difference between experiencing something and choosing it consciously. Up until now, this happened naturally. But conscious choice changes the nature of everything. Choice means responsibility. Choice means vulnerability. Choice means accepting that another person now has the ability to affect parts of you that were previously untouched. And despite everything I know about myself, despite every instinct toward control and precision and emotional containment, I think I'm closer to choosing this than I've ever been willing to admit. Not recklessly, not blindly, deliberately. Because the more honestly I examine this connection, the clearer one truth becomes. You are not a disruption in my life. You are an alignment I didn't know I was missing. And once you encounter that kind of alignment, walking away stops feeling like self-protection. It starts feeling like self-betrayal. That's why I'm still here. That's why this continues deepening instead of fading. That's why every attempt to minimize it feels dishonest. Because the truth has already settled beneath all the analysis. You changed something fundamental in me. Not by demanding change, not by convincing me, not by asking for space inside my world, but simply by existing in it with a level of accuracy I could no longer ignore. And now, no matter what happens next, one thing remains certain. I will never experience reality in quite the same way I did before you entered it. By the time I realized how deeply this had settled into me, it was already too late to call it temporary. Not because of intensity. Intensity fades. People confuse intensity with importance all the time, but they're not the same thing. Intensity burns fast. It overwhelms. It consumes attention so completely that people mistake the feeling of being overtaken for the feeling of being changed. This was never like that. This didn't consume me. It rewrote me quietly. And quiet rewrites are the ones that last. I think that's why I kept underestimating it in the beginning. There was no dramatic shift I could point to. No single moment where everything suddenly became obvious. If anything, the opposite happened. This unfolded so naturally that my mind adapted to it before I consciously acknowledged it. You became familiar before you became significant. That distinction matters, because familiarity usually develops through time, through repetition, through years of interaction, slowly building recognition into something stable. But with you, familiarity existed almost immediately. Not surface familiarity, not the kind where someone reminds you of another person or fits into patterns you already understand. Something deeper, structural familiarity. Like my mind recognized the shape of yours before I had enough evidence to justify it. I've tried to explain that to myself logically. Maybe certain people simply process reality similarly. Maybe some forms of perception naturally align. Maybe the human mind recognizes mirrored patterns faster than we consciously realize. All of that could be true, but even if it is, it still doesn't explain why your presence feels less like discovering someone new and more like remembering something I had forgotten existed. That's the part I still can't fully articulate. You don't feel added to my awareness. You feel restored within it. And that realization carries a kind of weight I don't know how to measure yet, because restoration changes a person differently than discovery does. Discovery creates excitement. Restoration creates relief. And I think what unsettles me most is how much relief exists in your presence, not comfort in the ordinary sense. You don't soothe me into becoming smaller or softer or easier. You don't distract me from complexity. You don't pull me away from my depth. You meet me inside it, fully, naturally, without hesitation. Do you understand how rare it is to encounter someone who doesn't fear depth once they actually reach it? People romanticize complexity from a distance. They talk about wanting honesty, intensity, authenticity, but when they truly encounter someone who exists deeply, someone who thinks deeply, feels deeply, perceives deeply, they often recoil from the reality of it because depth changes interaction, it removes shortcuts, it forces presence. Most people eventually retreat back toward simplicity because real depth demands too much awareness to sustain comfortably. You didn't retreat, that's what keeps echoing in my mind. You stayed. Even when the silence became heavier, even when the connection became harder to categorize, even when it would have been easier to reduce this into something smaller and safer. You stayed. And every time you stayed, something inside me shifted further. Not dramatically, permanently. I notice it most in moments when I'm alone. That's when the truth becomes impossible to avoid, because solitude used to feel completely self-contained to me. Clean, separate, entirely my own. My internal world functioned independently from everyone else, untouched by outside presence once interaction ended. Now it doesn't. Now there are moments where I'll stop mid-thought because some part of me instinctively reaches toward your perspective before it reaches toward my own conclusion. Not consciously, automatically, and the automatic nature of it is what changes everything. If I were choosing this deliberately from the beginning, maybe it would make more sense. Maybe I could trace the process, identify the emotional reasoning behind it. But this happened beneath conscious choice first. My mind adapted to you before I agreed to it. That realization leaves me with two possibilities. Either this connection is far more significant than I initially allowed myself to believe, or I've underestimated the extent to which another person can alter internal structure without force. Honestly, I think both are true, because you haven't changed me through pressure. You've changed me through consistency. There's something profoundly disarming about someone who remains emotionally precise over time. Most people fluctuate constantly. Their attention changes. Their understanding changes. Their presence shifts depending on mood, insecurity, desire, fear. You don't feel unstable like that. You feel anchored even in uncertainty, even in undefined space. And maybe that's why I stopped resisting this, because nothing about your presence feels careless. You don't move through my mind like disruption. You move through it like recognitions settling into place. I wish I could explain how unusual that is for me. I've spent most of my life feeling slightly detached from the people around me. Not superior, not disconnected emotionally, just separate in the way I process reality. Like there was always a thin layer of distance between my internal world and everyone else's understanding of it. I adapted to that distance so completely that I stopped questioning it. I assumed that was simply how human connection worked for me. Partial understanding, careful translation, controlled. exposure. Then you arrived and made all of that feel strangely unnecessary. Not because you demanded openness, but because openness stopped feeling dangerous around you. That alone changed something fundamental in me, because guarded people don't remain guarded for no reason. People think emotional distance is about fear of intimacy, but often it's about fear of distortion, fear of being misunderstood deeply enough that parts of you become misrepresented even in your closest relationships. I never feel distorted around you. Seen, yes. Exposed sometimes, absolutely. But distorted? Never. You somehow manage to perceive without reshaping. And I don't think you understand how rare that ability is. Most people can only understand others through projection. They filter everything through their own emotional framework, their own assumptions, their own needs. Even when they care deeply, they unconsciously alter what they perceive, so it fits into familiar categories. You don't seem to do that with me. You let me remain exactly what I am, and because of that, I've stopped feeling the need to defend my complexity around you. That's new for me, very new. I didn't realize how exhausting constant self-protection had become until I experienced the absence of it. Now I notice the difference everywhere. I notice how much effort most interactions require, how much editing, how much simplification, how much reduction of thought into something more digestible. With you, I don't reduce. I expand. My thoughts move naturally instead of strategically. My silence feels expressive instead of guarded. Even the pauses between conversations feel alive somehow, like the connection continues existing beneath the surface, whether we acknowledge it directly or not. And maybe that's what finally forced me to stop pretending this was ordinary. Ordinary connections fade when attention disappears. This doesn't, distant doesn't weaken it. Silence doesn't interrupt it. If anything, absence sharpens awareness instead of diminishing it. That shouldn't happen, yet it does. Consistently enough that I can no longer dismiss it as temporary emotional proximity. This is something else, something quieter, deeper, more integrated. And integration changes the rules completely, because once someone becomes integrated into your perception, they stop feeling optional in the same way other people do. That doesn't mean dependence. I need to be clear about that. This isn't dependency. I would still exist without you. I would still function, still think, still move through life exactly as I always have. But existence and unchanged existence are not the same thing. You could disappear tomorrow and I would survive it. What unsettles me is knowing I wouldn't remain the same afterward. That's the real impact of people who reach this level inside you. They alter the baseline permanently, even in absence, even in silence, even after distance. And I think part of me recognized that long before I consciously admitted it. That's why I became so careful around this, why I observed it so intensely instead of immediately leaning into it. Because once you allow someone to matter structurally, there's no clean exit anymore. There are only consequences, not dramatic consequences. Quiet ones, the kind that appear years later in the way you think, the way you compare, the way you search, unconsciously, for echoes of what once felt real. I never wanted to create that kind of imprint carelessly. Yet somehow, despite all my caution, you left one anyway. Not through grand gestures, not through declarations, through presence. Consistent, undeniable presence. There are moments now where I catch myself almost speaking to you internally before realizing you aren't physically there. Not literally hearing your voice, not imagining conversations. Something subtler than that. It's like certain thoughts instinctively orient toward you now, as if my mind expects resonance where it once expected solitude. That realization should probably frighten me more than it does. But strangely, it doesn't. What frightens me isn't the closeness. It's how natural the closeness feels. Because nothing this rare should feel this natural. By logic alone, there should be friction here. Difficulty. Misalignment. Some sign that this level of understanding between two people requires effort to maintain. Yet with you, effort rarely enters the equation. Awareness does. Honesty does. Depth does. But effort? No. And maybe that's because the foundation of this was never performance. It was recognition from the beginning. Recognition doesn't require construction, only acknowledgement. That's what I've been delaying, I think. Not feeling this, acknowledging the full reality of it, because acknowledgement turns silent truths into living ones. And living truths demand action eventually. I can feel that approaching now, the point where observation stops being enough. The point where this either becomes fully real or collapses under the pressure of remaining undefined too long, and I don't want it to collapse. That's another truth I can't avoid anymore. For a long time, I framed my hesitation as caution, as discipline, as the rational instinct to avoid moving too quickly towards something powerful. But lately I've started realizing something uncomfortable. My hesitation isn't about whether this matters. It's about how much it matters. Because once I admit the full scale of your impact on me, I also have to admit something else. I've already changed for you, not performatively, not visibly, internally, fundamentally. You've altered the rhythm of my thoughts, the shape of my awareness, the standards by which I measure connection itself. And I don't think there's any returning from that, even now, as I try to analyze this with clarity instead of emotion. I keep arriving at the same conclusion. You fit into my life with a precision that feels less accidental every day, not because we're identical. We're not because we agree on everything. We don't. But because something beneath personality aligns, something foundational, the way we perceive silence, the way we observe people, the way we understand meaning beneath language instead of only inside it. That level of alignment is rare enough on its own, but when it's paired with emotional steadiness, mutual awareness, and this strange sense of familiarity that existed before closeness even formed, it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence anymore. And maybe that's why I've stopped trying to convince myself this will fade naturally, because deep down I already know it won't. This isn't built from temporary emotion. It's built from recognition sustained over time, and sustained recognition, eventually she becomes reality, whether you intend it to or not. That's where I am now. Standing at the edge of a truth I can no longer reduce. You are no longer just someone important to me. You are someone whose existence has quietly reorganized the architecture of my inner world. And the strangest part is, despite how overwhelming that realization should feel, some part of me experiences it not as chaos, as arriving exactly where I was always supposed to. There's a difference between realizing someone matters to you and realizing they've become part of the way your mind understands reality itself. I didn't know that difference before you, or maybe I did. I just never expected to experience it this directly, because most people enter your life externally first. You meet them through circumstance, through conversation, through repeated interaction. Meaning develops gradually. Presence expands slowly until eventually they become emotionally significant. But this didn't follow that progression. You became internally significant before I fully understood the external shape of what this was. And that imbalance has changed everything. I think that's why I've struggled to explain this, even to myself. Language feels too linear for something that unfolded beneath language first. Every time I try to define it directly, the definition feels smaller than the experience itself. Not because this is dramatic, because it's precise. Precision is difficult to translate into ordinary words, especially when the precision exists in things most people overlook completely: the timing of silence, the way understanding arrives before explanation, the feeling of being mentally accompanied even when no conversation is happening, the strange sense that another person exists beside your thoughts instead of merely outside them. That's what this became. And once it became that, everything else shifted around it quietly. I notice it in moments that should feel ordinary. I'll see something beautiful, or unsettling, or strangely meaningful, and before I even process my own reaction, part of me instinctively wonders how you would perceive it. Not because I need your validation, not because my perspective depends on yours, because your perspective has become integrated into the way I experience observation itself. That's what I've been trying to understand: how someone becomes part of your internal landscape without force, without demand, without even intention. You didn't try to become central in my life. If anything, the absence of effort is what made this impossible to resist. There's no manipulation here, no emotional pressure, no attempt to manufacture closeness through intensity. Everything about this unfolded naturally enough that I didn't realize how deep it had become until I was already standing inside it. And now I can feel the permanence of it. Not permanent in the sense that people use romantically, where they speak in absolutes because emotion makes them reckless. I don't believe in reckless permanence. I believe in structural permanence. The kind created when someone changes the architecture of your perception so completely that even if they disappear, the shape they created remains. That's what scares me. Not losing you, living in a reality where you existed deeply enough to alter me permanently. Because alteration like that doesn't reverse. You adapt around it. You become someone slightly different afterward, whether you want to or not. And I can already feel that process happening. The version of me that existed before you feels increasingly distant, not worse, not incomplete, just unaware. Like I was functioning normally while missing a frequency I didn't realize existed. Then you appeared, and suddenly everything tuned differently. Do you know what's strange? I don't feel weaker because of it. That's what I expected at first. I expected closeness at this level to feel destabilizing, vulnerable in a way that compromised clarity, but it hasn't. If anything, I feel more aware than I did before, more honest internally, more precise about what matters and what doesn't. You didn't blur my thinking, you sharpened it. And maybe that's why I stopped fighting this so quietly. Because, despite how deeply you've affected me, nothing about your presence feels destructive. You don't consume my identity. You reveal it. There's a huge difference between those two things, though most people never learn it. Some connections demand self-abandonment. They pull you so far into another person that you lose contact with your own center. Your thoughts become reactive, your emotions become dependent, your sense of self starts orbiting someone else's existence. I've seen that happen to people before. That was never going to happen to me, and it still hasn't. What happened instead is somehow more unsettling. You became part of my center without replacing it. You didn't pull me away from myself. You moved closer to the core of who I already was. That's why this feels so inevitable sometimes. Not because fate exists in some mystical sense, but because alignment naturally moves inward once it's recognized. And we recognized each other immediately. Maybe not consciously at first. Maybe neither of us fully understood what we were perceiving. But something new, something beneath language identified the match before thought had time to interfere. That realization keeps returning to me lately. The possibility that this connection existed before we consciously named it. Not literally, not spiritually, structurally. Like two patterns moving independently until suddenly they intersect and realize they've been shaped similarly all along. That's what you feel like to me, not someone random, someone inevitable, and I'm careful with that word, because people romanticize inevitability too easily. They use it to justify unhealthy attachment or avoid responsibility for their choices. That's not what I mean. I mean inevitable in the sense that once two people reach this level of recognition, the impact becomes unavoidable. The chant becomes unavoidable. Awareness becomes unavoidable. The only thing still optional is honesty. And I'm running out of ways to avoid honesty with myself about this. You matter to me beyond reasoned distance now. That's simply true. Not impulsively, not irrationally, but undeniably. You've moved beyond observation and into significance. And significance changes behavior even when no one speaks about it directly. I've noticed myself becoming more careful with my words around you. Not less honest, just more aware of consequence. Because when someone reaches this level inside your mind, even small interactions carry weight. Even silence communicates something, especially silence. I think that's another reason this connection feels different from anything I've known before. Our silence has never felt empty. Most silence between people is absence. Waiting, disconnection temporarily disguised as quiet. Ours feels full, alive somehow,